Australia has many explorer stories, but only one that ends in a question mark. Ludwig Leichhardt, naturalist, wanderer, obsessive note-taker, arrived with a mind full of science and left behind one of the country's greatest mysteries. He mapped rivers, recorded plants, observed animals, sent specimens back to the world's leading scientists. And then, in 1848, he disappeared. No confirmed campsite, no journal recovered, no conclusive evidence. Just a name and a trail that dissolves into the interior. Leichhardt was born in Prussia on the 23rd of October 1813 in the hamlet of Trebach, one of 8 children raised in a practical world, farming, work, duty. His education was intense and wide-ranging. Boarding school, then a gymnasium at Cottbus, then the universities of Berlin and Göttingen. At first, he studied philosophy and languages, but something shifted. A friendship with a fellow student, John Nicholson, pulled him towards science, toward the natural world, and the habit of looking closely. Leichhardt became the kind of person who pursued knowledge, not for a job, not for a title, but simply because he couldn't stop. He drifted away from formal syllabuses, stopped chasing degrees, and no university ever conferred one on him. And yet, later, people began calling him doctor. Not because a certificate said so, but because everyone around him could see it. He lived like a scholar. In 1837, Leichhardt went to England with William Nicholson, and for years the two lived frugally, using what little money they had to feed a bigger hunger. Learning. They studied medical and natural science wherever they could, at the Royal College of Surgeons, the British Museum, the Jardin des Plantes, and by field observation across Europe. And then Nicholson did something extraordinary. He paid Leichhardt's fare to Australia, equipped him with clothing and necessities, and gave him £200, a small fortune invested in a friend's dream. Leichhardt sailed from London in October 1841 and arrived in Sydney on the 14th of February 1842. He came with a clear intention to explore inland Australia, not as a conqueror, but as an observer. For 6 months he studied around Sydney, lecturing on geology and botany, hoping for an official role. A museum post, a curatorship, even the botanical garden. Nothing came. No appointment, no salary, no institution to attach himself to. So he did what he always did. He went into the field. He travelled to the Hunter River Valley, studying geology, flora, fauna, watching farming and viticulture, taking notes with the seriousness of a man who believed detail mattered. Then came long overland journeys, alone, between Newcastle and the Moreton Bay district through 1843 and early 1844. By mid-1844, he returned to Sydney, arranged his collection, plants and rocks, and tried to secure a place on a government expedition to Port Essington. The Surveyor General Thomas Mitchell was willing to lead, but Governor Gipps refused to sanction it, calling it too hazardous, too expensive, without approval from the Colonial Office. Leichhardt didn't like delays, he didn't like uncertainty, and he didn't like waiting for permission, so he decided to do it himself, with private subscriptions of volunteers and determination. In August 1844, Leichhardt and his party set out, moving to the Moreton Bay district and then leaving Jimbaugh on the Darling Downs on the 1st of October, the farthest edge of settlement. The expedition was hard and it was dangerous. 2 men turned back, and in June 1845, John Gilbert, a naturalist with the group, was killed when their camp was attacked, but Leichhardt pressed on, and on the 17th of December 1845, the remaining 7 reached Port Essington, having crossed nearly 3,000 miles overland. About 4,828 kilometres. When they returned to Sydney in March 1846, many had assumed they'd died, so their arrival sparked rejoicing, and Leichhardt was hailed as the Prince of Explorers. He received a government grant of £1,000 and private subscriptions that brought the reward higher still. But for Leichhardt, the triumph wasn't the applause, it was the data. He prepared his journal for publication in England, gave lectures on geology, botany, and natural history, and began organising the next expedition. And in the middle of this scientific work, there's a detail that matters, because it tells you who he really was. Leichhardt wasn't collecting specimens as souvenirs. He was feeding a global scientific network. He sent fossils and other material back to Europe, into the hands of the leading anatomists and scientists of the day, including Richard Owen, the British paleontologist, who would later coin the word Dinosauria. In other words, Leichhardt wasn't just pushing into unknown country. He was exporting Australia's deep history, turning field discoveries into science. That's the part many people miss. Then came the obsession that would define his end. Leichhardt planned a transcontinental crossing, from the Darling Downs to the west coast, then down to the Swan River settlement. In late 1846, he set out with a party of 8, but conditions were brutal. Heavy rain, animals straying, fever weakening the group. After only about 500 miles, roughly 805 kilometres, they were forced to turn back in June 1847. Most people would have paused. Leichhardt didn't. After a short rest, he rode again, covering hundreds of miles, examining river systems and country between routes, collecting observations. By early 1848, he assembled another party of 7 determined to try again. He believed he could solve Central Australia's problems if he could skirt the northern edge of the desert. He set out from the Condamine River in March 1848, and by the 3rd of April reached McPherson's station, Kogoon, on the Darling Downs. Then the expedition moved inland and vanished. No confirmed trace, no final message, no definitive end, just disappearance. During his lifetime, Leichhardt's work was widely respected. In 1847, the Geographical Society in Paris shared its annual prize, and the Royal Geographical Society in London awarded him the Patron's Medal, recognising the knowledge gained from his Port Essington journey. Prussia even pardoned him for failing to return home when due for compulsory military training. Scientists valued his records for their restraint and accuracy. In an age famous for exaggerated travellers' tales, Leichhardt believed something simple, almost modern. If the traveller is truthful, the scientist at home will be thankful. And yet, Leichhardt was complicated. Some hosts described him as amiable, dedicated, a guest worth supporting. But some who travelled with him described him very differently. Jealous, selfish, suspicious, careless, slovenly, unfit for leadership. Both things may contain truth, because a single-minded devotion to research can look like brilliance from the outside and ruthlessness up close. Even his faith became part of the story. Raised Lutheran but growing independent of church teaching, he kept only a simple statement of belief. After his disappearance, the legend grew, and so did the criticism. And because he never returned, he never got to answer for himself. So what do we do with Leichhardt? We can reduce him to the mystery, the vanished expedition, the unanswered question, or we can see the larger story. A man who treated Australia like a living laboratory, who recorded landscapes and species with care, who shipped specimens and fossils back into the world's scientific bloodstream, who helped create early maps and expanded European understanding of a continent. And then somewhere beyond Kogoon, in 1848, he walked out of the written record. In the end, Leichhardt's story isn't only about disappearance. It's about how much of Australia was once known, only through the eyes of people moving slowly through it, observing, recording, trying to understand. And it leaves us with a final quiet thought. Sometimes the most important explorers aren't remembered for what they found, but for what they tried to see before the land swallowed the trail.